Julianne Ginter.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker. Tēnā koutou e te whare. The Green Party is supporting this tax bill. It's largely uncontroversial. It does fall well short of the changes that would be needed to have a fairer, simpler tax system that creates a smarter, greener New Zealand where everyone has the same opportunities, which is what the Green Party would like to see. But nobody would have expected that from the National Party. I don't think any substantial changes that would actually create a fairer, greener New Zealand. Unfortunately, the last 7.5 years have shown that all they're really interested in doing is tinkering around the edges and protecting the status quo. But this bill, and a lot of credit has to be given to the officials and the well-informed submissions we received at Select Committee. This bill does make some completely reasonable changes, although they are small. So the three main changes in this bill, which have been mentioned by other members here today, are, of course, the residential land withholding tax, which is bringing in line the rest of the tax system with the new changes from the government's Bright Line test bills, which were a package of bills the goal of which was to reduce property speculation. Unfortunately, that package of bills is woefully inadequate to actually create a fair tax system and reduce the harmful tax loopholes that currently exist, which incentivize overinvestment in property rather than the productive sectors of the economy, and have led to in part, the rapid increase in prices in Auckland, which is now spilling out into other parts of the country. So this part of the bill is simply enacting the residential land withholding tax so that offshore buyers are at the point of sale of the house have a certain amount withheld to ensure that they do meet their tax liabilities here in New Zealand. The problem with this and the rest of the package is that the Bright Line test only applies to residential land, which is going to be a very difficult test, I think, to apply in practice, because any land in New Zealand really could be used for residential purposes if people go through the right resource consent applications to get consent to build residential. And it doesn't make sense that you would gather tax on residential land only when there are capital gains which are realized on other types of land. So it's a really bizarre distinction that the government has introduced in their Bright Line test. The other really obvious problem with the Bright Line test package is that it only applies to properties that are bought and sold within 2 years. Of course, the vast majority of OECD countries have a comprehensive capital gains tax, which usually excludes the family home, which is the Green Party's policy for New Zealand. And for those that have holding periods, the average holding period is 5 years, and many countries have longer holding periods. And that's how you can effectively reduce this perverse incentive to invest in property, where ultimately it's usually windfall gains that people are receiving. And there's no reason why the income they receive from that windfall of having bought a property and sold it at the right time during a property boom, why that shouldn't be taxed just like any other income. At the Select Committee, we heard a lot of submissions on this. I think it is quite tricky to apply the residential land withholding tax. There is a certain amount of bureaucracy that's created by it, and that's why it's unfortunate that the rest of the package of the Bright Line test doesn't apply to more properties. I think it would make it much simpler and easier. It would make more sense to have the residential land withholding tax apply to all property sales, because obviously if people, overseas buyers, are investing in property in New Zealand, making money off that, it makes sense that they should have to pay tax on the income that they receive from that windfall. And that's part of how we have a fair, simpler tax system that gives opportunities to everyone and creates a thriving economy. Actually, capital gains tax, I can't overemphasize the importance of taxing capital for achieving a whole range of good outcomes for New Zealand, one of which is more innovation and investment in the productive sectors of the economy, research and development, et cetera, rather than just throwing all of our money into property. And also from a fairness point of view, ensuring that housing is available to all those, that it's affordable to all New Zealanders, because part of Yeah, but it's actually really seriously exacerbating inequality to not have something like a capital gains tax or even an annual capital tax. The second change that this bill makes is providing for GST to be levied on online services. And a number of members in the House have talked about that today. The Green Party can support this in principle because it does make sense to ensure that all goods and services have GST applied on them. And in our changing, more globalized economy, people are able to purchase more goods and services from overseas using the internet, and it makes sense that GST should apply to those so we aren't disadvantaging New Zealand businesses who are selling goods and services here in New Zealand. They have to pay GST. It makes sense that online international purchases should also have GST apply to them. But unfortunately, this is only applying to about half of the problem. Actually, it might be significantly less than half the problem because it's only online services and not goods that are purchased, and particularly low-value goods that are purchased from overseas. So that's something that the government still has to deal with. And we heard from Retail New Zealand and other submitters that there was this, shortcoming in the bill. I'd raise one other issue, which unfortunately we didn't hear about in the Select Committee, but my colleague Mojo Mathers has raised with me, and I'm interested in seeing if there's other ways the government could be resolving this issue. And that is that for the many, many New Zealanders who have hearing impairments or deaf, like my colleague Mojo Mathers, Netflix is actually pretty much the only service that's fully captioned. Because the government isn't requiring captioning of television programs here in New Zealand or adequately funding it, for many deaf or hearing impaired people, the content that they want to access, they're basically limited to using services like Netflix. And so, of course, this is going to make it more expensive for them to access those services. There's also the problem of Netflix and similar companies providing these services, cracking down on access to content. We have access to less content here in New Zealand than many other countries have. So people like to use a VPN, say, to access Netflix in the United States because there's a wider variety of content. So this is an issue that I think the government really needs to be engaging with, because New Zealanders are missing out here, and particularly those hearing impaired New Zealanders are going to have to be paying more to watch content that is captioned because the New Zealand government is failing to deal with the captioning issue here in New Zealand. And so that's something, obviously, I don't think that it makes sense to exclude Netflix from having to pay GST simply because of this problem, but we should be trying to address both the problems of content and captioning here in New Zealand. And National really isn't taking any steps in that direction that I can see. Finally, there's the student loan information. And so this was tricky for the Green Party because, to be quite frank, we don't agree with the policy of loading up students with debt to have education. We don't think that's how you build a smart green economy, by forcing students to take out huge amounts of debt, which they then have hanging over them for many years after they finish their degrees. We think that we should be providing students with opportunities to get an education, and if one doesn't have that debt hanging over one after finishing our studies, then there's the possibility to take risks, to be entrepreneurial, to use the information and skills that we've acquired during our studies to do things that are going to make New Zealand and the world a better and more exciting place, and that's good for our economy. So it doesn't make sense to crack down on students, but that's not the subject of this bill. This bill was tightening up some aspects of it, allowing information sharing between Australia, IRD, and the Australian Taxation Office. I would have to ask the question, particularly because only last week the government admitted it has no idea the amount of tax that is missing out on from multinational companies who are avoiding paying tax. Why are we putting so much effort to chasing down students who owe money simply because they got an education here, rather than the estimated $500 million to $1 billion a year we're missing out on because multinational corporations who are operating in this country are avoiding paying tax? I would like to see more information sharing, and more work through the OECD to solve the problem of tax avoidance and tax evasion rather than cracking down on students. But there is one good provision which includes streamlining the rules applying to borrowers who work overseas but are entitled to interest-free student loans because they work for approved charities. I think that's a good thing. So ultimately, the Green Party supports the bill.
Order. Thank you. Members' time has expired.